The problem was never the accounts. The problem, as Everton Blackmore, the Earl of Ravenstone, would spend the better part of 8 months discovering, was the interviews. Settle in, friends. Pull your chair a little closer to the fire. I have a story for you tonight. Not a dramatic one, not the kind with villains and grand betrayals. The kind with something rarer. 2 people who were honest with each other at exactly the right moment. That sort of thing, in my experience, is worth more than any scandal. The Earl had conducted 12 interviews over those 8 months. In the great stone study of Blackmore Hall, with the methodical attention he gave every decision of consequence. He had turned away every candidate, not carelessly, but with reasons. One man had excellent references, and a smile that suggested he intended to agree with the Earl, regardless of what the Earl said. One woman had managed the accounts of a larger estate than Blackmore without a single error in 7 years, and he had turned her away anyway, because her answers were entirely correct and somehow completely hollow. He could not explain the instinct more precisely than to say he had felt during the interview as though he were talking to his own reflection and finding it slightly dull. His land steward, a quiet, reliable man named Mr. Doyle, who had served 3 generations of Blackmores, stopped commenting on the rejections after the 7th. Not from any lack of opinion. Age had not diminished his supply of those. But by the 7th interview, he had identified the precise nature of his employer's difficulty, and concluded that commentary was not going to move it. The 13th candidate arrived on a Wednesday morning in late October. She had come by way of a connection at the county registry, a recommendation so brief it occupied 3 lines, Miss Audra Fenwick. 7 years, Whitfield and Associates. I believe she understands what an estate actually requires. Mr. Doyle left the note on the Earl's desk without comment, which was itself a form of comment. When a man of 40 years' loyal service says nothing, he is usually saying the most important thing. Pay attention to the silences of people who have earned them. She arrived at precisely the time stated. 3 of the previous 12 had been late, 2 presumptuously early. She was perhaps 32, with the composed, unhurried manner of someone who had long since decided that composure was more useful than performance. She sat across the broad oak desk, folded her hands, and waited for him to begin. He had delivered this particular preamble 12 times now, and had refined it into something efficient. The size of the estate, the 3 farms, the timber operation, the mill lease, the household of 14, and its persistent low-level anxiety. He was 4 sentences in when Miss Fenwick said, quite calmly, "Forgive me. May I ask who prepared the accounts you're referring to?" He stopped. He looked at her. She looked back with the direct, steady attention of someone who has asked a genuine question and intends to receive a genuine answer. "My late estate manager," he said, and before him his predecessor. How long ago did the current arrangement begin to feel unmanageable? None of the previous 12 had asked anything like it. "About 3 years," he said. "Have the accounts been audited in that time?" "The solicitor reviews them annually." "That is not an audit," she said, not unkindly, the plain manner of someone correcting a fact rather than a person. "A solicitor confirms the numbers add up. An audit asks whether they're the right numbers." The study was quiet. The Earl looked at the woman across the desk and thought, with the startled quality of a man hearing for the first time a thing he should have heard 3 years ago. No one has said that before. "Go on," he said. She asked 12 questions in the next 20 minutes, not answers, questions, each arising naturally from the last, each aimed at something he had not examined, or had examined without honesty. Had he reviewed the mill lease terms recently, and was the current lessee the original tenant? He knew this year's yield on the 3 farms. Did he know how it compared to 5 years prior, adjusted for soil rotation? When he called the household budget a source of anxiety, was the anxiety about the total figure or about not being able to predict it? Several times his answer was no. Once he did not know at all. She received each answer without expression, noted something in a small leather notebook, and moved to the next question. When she finished, she set the notebook on her knee. "The estate is not in difficulty," she said, "but it is being managed reactively rather than preventively, and reactive management at this scale produces exactly the anxiety you describe. Not because things are going wrong, but because you cannot tell, from where you sit, whether they're about to. You determined all that," he said, "from 12 questions. From your answers to 12 questions. You already knew it. You had simply never been asked to say it in sequence." He looked at her in the pale October light and thought, 12 interviews, and this is the first conversation. The 12 were not the problem. I was interviewing for the wrong thing. What were the previous candidates offering? That I kept accepting. She studied him a moment, deciding whether the question was genuine, and decided it was. "Management," she said. "Lists, reports, summaries of what had already happened. You accepted those because you believed information was the same as understanding. It isn't. Information tells you what occurred. Understanding tells you what it means and what comes next. You have been hiring people to tell you things, when what you needed was someone to think with you." Now, friends, I want to sit with that sentence a moment, because it's worth examining. Telling you things versus thinking with you. I have known many people who were good at one and hopeless at the other. The Earl, to his considerable credit, recognized the difference immediately. That is rarer than you'd suppose. If you're enjoying this so far, I'd ask you kindly to consider subscribing to Moonlight at Ravenwood. It costs nothing, and it keeps stories like this one finding their way to the fire. Now, back to the study. "Why the accounts first?" he asked, "before anything else." "Because the accounts are where decisions leave traces," she said. "A right decision leaves one kind, a decision made under pressure, or without full information, or because no one wanted to say the difficult thing, leaves another. I wanted to know what kind of traces Blackmore Hall had been leaving. And what did you find? That most of the decisions were reasonable, and that some were made because the person making them didn't believe they had permission to say, 'I don't know yet,' which suggests an employer who requires certainty from people who aren't yet certain, and gets the appearance of it, instead of the thing itself." A long pause. "You are describing a flaw," he said. "I am describing a pattern. Whether it's a flaw depends on whether it continues." He thought 3 things in quick succession. She is right. She said it to my face without softening it. I am going to hire her now, or ask the one question that tells me whether I should. "Why?" he said. "Are you telling me this in an interview, rather than waiting until you have the position?" "Because I need this position," she said, holding his gaze, "and because I calculated that a man who has interviewed 12 people and hired none of them is either very particular or looking for something the others didn't provide. I decided to provide it, and let the result tell me which kind of man you are. And if I had rejected you for it, then you'd have been the second kind, and I'd have thanked you for your time. When can you begin?" Something moved through her expression, the briefest flash of relief, quickly settled. "The 1st of November, if that suits." "The 1st of November," he agreed. They stood. She offered her hand, the firm, unhurried handshake of someone completing a negotiation she'd been prepared for since she walked in. "Miss Fenwick, the previous managers, some of the decisions I called insufficient were not insufficient. Some were right, and I said nothing at the time to indicate it." "I suspected as much," she said, "from the traces." "The 1st of November," he said again. "The 1st of November." She left. Mr. Doyle appeared in the doorway some 45 seconds later, with the expression of a man who had found a spot near the adjacent hallway convenient. "She begins the 1st of November, the Earl said. "Very good, my lord." A pause. "I thought she might." "Not a word, Doyle." "Of course not, my lord." He was lying, of course, with such complete composure that the Earl, to his own surprise, did not mind. This is the thing about people who have been right all along, friends. They don't need to say so. The rightness is already in the room. She proved, as her references promised, extraordinarily competent. Though it wasn't the competence that surprised him, it was its texture. Not the competence of someone managing a system, but of someone who understood the system well enough to see where it worked against itself, and quietly began correcting it. The results were not dramatic. Dramatic results, she told him once, were usually evidence that a problem had been allowed to become urgent. She preferred boring ones. She had a gift for them. By the second week she had read the original mill lease, found a clause misread for 4 years, and written to the lessee a letter so precise and politely unanswerable that the matter closed within 10 days. By the third week, the timber operation had its first honest quarterly projection. Not a record of what had happened, but a reckoning of what was likely to, with the assumptions named plainly. By the fourth week, he opened the monthly accounts for the first time in memory, without the dull, anticipatory dread of a man expecting bad news. He sent her a note. The mill matter was handled correctly. The projection is exactly what was needed. Thank you. She wrote back that the lease should be renegotiated in full come spring, and that the timber estimate assumed stable weather through February, which Upper Canada did not reliably provide. She had added a contingency figure on the second page. He turned to the second page. He had not noticed until then that there was one. He wrote that the figure was sensible, and asked that such analysis continue. She wrote back that it already had. This was the third report. The first two had also had second pages. He went back and read them in full. She was right. He had read the summaries and stopped there, with all 12 managers before her, and none had mentioned it, and he had never thought to ask. She hadn't mentioned it either, until he demonstrated he was paying attention, and then she said so plainly, with no accusation in it. The pages existed. He had simply been missing them. He raised it when she came to present the November accounts, in the same chair she'd taken in October. You didn't tell me about the second pages. No. Why not? I wasn't certain in October whether the issue was habit or intent, she said. If you'd been deliberately avoiding detail you found unwelcome, that would have been a different conversation. I waited to see which it was. And now you know it was habit. You read the mill letter in full. You read the contingency figure. You went back and found the earlier ones. How did you know I went back? You referenced a figure in your last note that only appeared in October's second page. You never did that with September's. He thought, she was watching to see if I would correct myself. She gave me room to, without making it a lesson. In 9 years of running this estate, no one had done that. He said nothing of it aloud. He simply noticed, in late November, that the tenant farmers had begun writing more directly, questions asked plainly instead of buried in pleasantries. When he mentioned it, she said she'd met each of them and told them the manager welcomed clear questions and would answer clearly. They had been worried the mill trouble meant instability, and she'd told them what it actually was, a 4-year clerical error. They needed to know, she said. So I told them. Without asking me. The information wasn't confidential. The uncertainty was costing them sleep. I made a judgment. Was it the right one? She considered this honestly. Yes, but I'll tell you when I'm not certain, so you can decide. He believed her. He found, without quite meaning to, that he had begun looking forward to the monthly presentations, not because the accounts had improved, though they had, but because that hour had become the most substantive conversation he had in any given month. What began as a review had turned, by December, into something more like a joint examination of the estate's reality. She knew the numbers, he knew the land and the tenants, and 30 years of accumulated specifics, why the Northfield drained the way it did in spring, why Eastwood's yield always ran low for its soil, and between them a figure came to mean something it hadn't meant alone. He noticed he'd once stayed an hour past her, leaving, without registering the time passing. He noticed that a presentation was delayed a day because she was managing trouble with the mill lessee. His awareness of the delay wasn't strictly professional. He noticed that he was noticing these things and was careful, for now, about what he concluded from them. And here, friends, I'd say carefulness was the right response. He had an estate to run. She was managing his accounts. These were not the conditions under which a sensible man rushes to conclusions, and the Earl of Ravenstone was whatever else, sensible. He had also been sensible for 38 years, and found it satisfying and, if we're honest, and I always prefer honesty, occasionally quite lonely. But that's getting ahead of things. In January, trouble surfaced at Eastwood. A drainage problem, noted and deferred for 3 years, now urgent with the thaw coming. She had flagged it in December's second page. He had not yet acted. She did not remind him of that when she raised it again. She simply said the timing wasn't flexible and that she'd found 2 contractors but hadn't contacted them because engaging them was his decision to make. He made it that afternoon and told her the next day. "I should have acted on it sooner," he said. "You acted on it now," she said. "That's what matters." Not forgiveness. The acknowledgement was too plain to need it. Something closer to, people learn at the pace they learn. What matters is that they do. He thought about that for a week, and then went to find her. She had claimed the small estate office in November. Once a storeroom of outdated correspondence and obsolete maps, and cleared it within days, sorting the maps by era and building a filing system that could locate any document from the past decade in under 3 minutes. She looked up from a ledger with the same unhurried attention she gave everything. "My lord." Miss Fenwick." He came in and stood by the window rather than the second chair, the one he'd noticed, angled toward visitors, as if she had anticipated he might eventually come to her. She had been right about that too. "I've been thinking," he said, "about something you said in October. That I'd been hiring people to tell me things, when what I needed was someone to think with me." "Yes. Did you know, when you said it, that you were also describing what you were offering?" "I knew what I was offering," she said carefully. "I was less certain you'd recognize it." "I recognized it. Rather more specifically," he said, "than is strictly relevant to the management of an estate." The office went quiet. Outside, February carried on, grey and indifferent. The open ledger sat between them, its columns knowing nothing of what was happening above them. "I see," she said finally. "I'm aware of how this complicates the position," he said. "I'm not saying it to create difficulty for you. I'm saying it because I've been not saying it since December, and the not saying has taken considerably more effort than I'm used to spending on silence." "It doesn't create a difficulty," she said after a moment. "It creates a question, what you intend to do with it." "Continue reading the second pages," he said. "Continue the presentations, continue asking you to think with me rather than simply tell me things, and stop pretending the reason I looked forward to January had anything to do with contingency figures." Something worked at the corner of her mouth, not quite a smile, its contained predecessor. "That is a very measured intention. I'm working within appropriate constraints. I've recently engaged 13 account managers and would strongly prefer not to need a 14th. The not-quite smile became the real thing, brief, complete, transforming. "You're worried I'll leave." "I'm worried about several things, in the correct order. Your comfort in this position is the first." She looked out the window a long moment. "I'll tell you something," she said. "I asked 12 questions in that interview because I'd been in positions before where I didn't ask the questions that needed asking. Not for lack of knowing them, but because I'd learned that asking was costly. I decided before I came to Blackmore Hall that I was finished paying that cost. That's why I asked. It wasn't cleverness. It was a decision I'd already made before I walked through the door. The decision that you'd say the true thing regardless of consequence. The decision that I would not manage myself into someone else's convenience, which has its costs, but so does the alternative. I want to tell you something as well," he said. "The 12 before you. I turned away because something was absent that I couldn't have named if you'd asked me directly. I called it a dozen things. None of them were accurate. What was absent was what you gave me in 4 sentences in October. The willingness to say the true thing without softening it. I'd been looking for it without knowing that's what I was looking for. When you found it, you recognized it. Immediately. That is not nothing, she said. Most people wouldn't have. Most would have shown me the door. I've been revising a calculation myself, she went on, since November. In October I calculated that a man who'd refused 12 candidates was either unreasonably exacting or genuinely looking for something real, and I bet on the latter. I was right. But since November, I've been revising a different calculation, that what I'd found in this position was what I'd been looking for in this kind of work. Something worth doing fully, for someone worth doing it for. That calculation has since acquired dimensions I hadn't originally included. The office was very quiet. Somewhere in the household a door closed, the ordinary business of a running estate. "Come to dinner," he said, "this evening, not as the accounts manager, as the person who found the second page and the mill clause 4 years after everyone else missed it, and sat in that study in October and asked 12 questions no one else thought to ask. That person, at dinner. The household will notice. Yes. It will occasion speculation. Inevitably. You're not concerned. I'm concerned about the correct things, in the correct order. You rank considerably higher than household speculation." "Dinner," she said. "At what time?" 7:30. 7:30. He left the office thinking that was 5 hours away, and that it was the longest 5 hours he had looked forward to in a very long time. He was right about that. And here, friends, I should tell you the rest of the story holds little drama. I say that without apology, because some of the best stories don't. What it holds instead is better. The steady accumulation of evenings between two people discovering, without performance, that the other was exactly what they hadn't known they were missing. Dinner at 7:30 became dinner on Tuesdays. Never announced. Simply the shape things took, the way right arrangements do, through repetition rather than declaration. She talked about the estate as a place rather than a ledger. A surveyor's mark on the eastward boundary stone, suggesting the old property line had run differently, which sent them, over 2 Tuesdays, into the family history he knew as a member of it, and she was reconstructing from the records. He talked about the tenants in the way the account books never could. Old Macpherson, 40 years on the same field, who understood its soil better than any report. The Eastwood family's real situation, more complicated than the rent rolls suggested. She had thoughts about it. Better thoughts than the land agents. He acted on them and told her so. "I know," she said. "You might have the grace to be modest. I save my modesty for situations where I'm uncertain." "Are you often uncertain?" She considered it honestly. "About accounts, rarely. I check carefully before I conclude. About people, more often. People are more variable than figures." "What are you uncertain about with people at present?" "At present," she said, "nothing." He held her look. "Good." She smiled. The full version, the one he'd been quietly collecting since October, and thought he could go on collecting it indefinitely without finding the collection tedious. On the Tuesday of the 14th week in March. Eastwood's drainage resolved, the mill lease renegotiated, the accounts in the best order they'd been in 9 years, he said, at the end of the evening. "I want to discuss the position, not to alter it, to ask whether it, as currently defined, still describes what it's become. The position is functioning well." "Yes." "Then, what's the difficulty with the terms?" "There is no difficulty with the terms," he said. "I want to add to them. These Tuesdays haven't been professional since November, and I've been aware of that, and haven't said so, and I find I'm no longer comfortable with the not saying." She was quiet a long moment. "When I came to Blackmore Hall," she said, "it was because the position was right, and because I'd decided to stop making myself smaller for the convenience of situations that didn't deserve it. I didn't come expecting the someone capable of recognizing good work to also be. She didn't finish it. Also what? Worth being honest with, she said, on matters that aren't in the ledger. Stay, he said. I already told you I'm staying in October. Not only as the accounts manager, as the person who asks the necessary questions and reads the second pages and tells me the true thing when it needs telling, in this house, for considerably longer than a contract specifies. You're asking me to marry you. Eventually. First I'm asking you to stay and let the rest arrive as it arrives. The staying and the marrying seem connected. They are. I prefer to be honest about what I'm asking. She held his gaze across the candles, down to their last hour now, the household quiet around them. You hired me, she said, because it was the first honest thing you'd heard in 8 months. And I intend to go on hearing honest things in this house for a very long time. Yes, she said. He breathed out, quietly, but with the distinct relief of a man permitted at last to set something down that he'd been carrying carefully for months. The position description will need revising, she said. Doyle can handle it. Doyle has been anticipating this since November. He'll be unbearable. He's already unbearable about the mill clause. It won't materially worsen. Mr. Doyle produced the revised document that Thursday morning in his own careful hand on the estate's formal stationery and set it on the desk with the composed satisfaction of a man who has been right about something since October and is now permitted to say so. It read, Position of Countess of Ravenstone. Responsibilities to include estate accounts oversight, quarterly projections, Tuesday dinners, and the correction of the Earl of Ravenstone on matters of substance in writing and in person as circumstances require. Second pages mandatory. Not a word, Doyle. Of course not, my lord. A pause. Shall I file it? File it. And so, friends, this is where I leave them. The Earl and the new Countess of Ravenstone. The county was still adjusting to the news with the focused energy of a community that had not expected it and was not entirely sure how to receive it. The accounts stood in order. The mill lease was settled. Eastwood's drainage had held through the thaw, and from that point on, the second pages were always read. He found her in the estate office one April afternoon, working through the spring projections, and showed her the filed document. Second pages mandatory, she read, and something private and amused crossed her face. That's the correct addition. The second page is always where the true accounting is. He took the chair beside the filing cabinet. The one that had appeared there sometime in December, that neither of them had ever needed to mention, because by December the question it answered had already been settled. You're thinking about the interview again, she said, without looking up. Yes. You think about it often. Regularly. Why? Because it's the 20 minutes that explain everything that followed. She looked up, he looked back. Yes, she said, it is. She returned to the projections. He stayed where he was, in the office that had been a storeroom in October, in the estate that had been running exactly as it should, since a Wednesday morning and 20 minutes and 12 questions, since a woman who had decided, before she ever walked through that door, to stop making herself smaller, and had offered him that decision plainly, and waited to see what he would do with it. He had recognized it, he had hired her, she had stayed. Everything else was simply the rest of their lives, which was, by any reasonable accounting, the most interesting estate either of them had ever managed. Now, dear friends, before we say goodnight, if this story found you at the right moment, if something in it felt recognizable, the cost of saying the true thing, the relief of being heard by someone worth saying it to, I hope you'll stay a while longer at Moonlight at Ravenwood. Subscribe, if you haven't yet. It costs you nothing, and it means stories like this one keep finding their way to the fire. New ones arrive regularly, and I would very much like you here when they do. Until next time, keep the fire burning.